Hey. Let me start my slides up. Yep. So this is going to be about the Bellucci Fanclub. I'll get to why it's called that here in a second. It's about the Trickbot forum. So I love to write a lot of detection rules. Pretty much anytime I see a threat that we catch, I think, is there more we could catch here and stuff like that. We've had a lot of cases where we've had ransomware run through an environment. Sometimes we take on a customer where they're in the middle of an incident, so we're in the middle of their dumpster fire, tire fire situations, so we can try to help them detect things and stop things before it gets worse, or sometimes we're too late. But I'm an Air Force cyber operator for the Air Force Reserve. I went to Italy. That was last year. For cyber things, and ate a lot of pizza and stuff, and only brought back like 4 bottles of wine. I should have brought, like, I had friends that brought back like 24 bottles of wine in their suitcases. I don't know how they did that, but and like I said, I'm kind of a moth to a dumpster fire, as it were. So like whenever there is a really bad incident for a customer, it sucks for them, but it's awesome for me because I get to learn, like, oh, they're doing all this stuff, they're moving this way or that, and that kind of stuff. So silver linings for me. So from my perspective, a lot of this stuff is, like, as a detection engineer, I'm going to be focused on what is detectable for some of these threats, threats for Trickbot and other ransomware stuff like this. So if you go through this same material from the Conti forum, if you're a red teamer, you might pull a lot of stuff from it because it's basically a red team manual. And some like policy stuff could easily be gleaned from this because there's a lot of security policy things that they're going to exploit in some of this stuff. And Conti's been disbanded since the war in Ukraine started, basically. So the reason why this kind of matters is because basically after they were disbanded, they basically just split off into a bunch of other groups, which I'll kind of throw in at the end here, some of those. So you'll basically see these same tools used in different ways. So the situation with this was when Russia invaded Ukraine. One of the people that was in the forum for the Conti Trickbot forum was a Ukrainian guy that was, like, glory to Ukraine, and was like, I'm just going to dump everything they've got online and put it on anon files. So he dumped all their internal forum and stuff like that. He did an interview with CNN. He said he's a cybersecurity researcher. I don't know. It's hard to know because, he's not really, like, he didn't really say what he did, but he's just a dude in Ukraine who just had access to these files and dumped them out. And yeah, there's like an interesting CNN article about him answering questions from a CNN reporter and some other stuff like that gives some context. And then he went off to the fight on the front of Ukraine. So the overview. What I remember noticing whenever this stuff came out was a lot of the chatter about, like, the chat logs, their Jabber server and stuff like that. But one of the interesting parts to me was the forum leak, which is that bottom one there, the Trickbot forum.leak.7zip file there. And it was basically a playbook, kind of like if you were on a football team and you're following your offensive team. It's basically a whole playbook on what things they do to escalate privileges and stuff like that. So this stuff wasn't in English. It was all in Russian, obviously. So there's a GitHub out there that I pulled from called Conti Leaks English, and this guy just ran it through Google Translate and I think another like deep something language learning model or something like that translated all of it. So that was really handy for me because I don't know how to read Russian. So I just took all those files from the dump and then made it into one text file and then played around with the formatting so I could read it because it was still not 100% readable, and they're like copies of web pages, so it's not exactly the most readable thing. So Bellucci is the person. She's a lady in the Matrix. I didn't know this until I presented the first time, and somebody's like, "Oh, isn't that the lady who, like, led them to the key maker or whatever?" I'm like, "Oh, well, I guess she's like an insider threat, maybe analogy. I'm not sure why the forum had that, but like if you were going through this text files from the Parmac guy, her name is at the top of all of it as the Monica Bellucci fan club. So I'm like, that's weird. Like, okay, I see her name all over the time, all over the place, and so there's probably, I guess, 148 pages because her name is in there 148 times, or maybe divided by two because there's like a top and bottom breadcrumb situation for these forums. Um, yeah, yeah, I think it's just kind of how the guy copied out the entire contents of the site, is he just copied the text from the website. Uh, so some things that they use, there's a mixture of tools. They use a lot of lulbins, so um, like I said, like just different tools that are already on Windows that are built into things. So like net to get recon of the network on usernames, hosts, and stuff like that. NLTest is like to get is a tool to like basically use the information about the domain controller, that kind of thing, and PowerShell stuff. Some red team tools, they use Cobalt Strike, Rubius, Seatbelt, and Sharp Chrome, and we'll get to those in a second. There's a lot of abused sysadmin tools, so like um, I, I I don't see these as much we see red teams in a network. We don't see these as often, but they'll use like ADFind, ngrok, and rclone, and some other stuff, and then a lot of remote access tools. I think I only had a couple on here, but I added a few more because I see a lot of remote access tools that are used because it's already a trusted tool that they can use to basically uh, get around your defenses and stuff like that because it's a trusted binary. So AnyDesk, Splashtop, Terra, there's a whole bunch of them. So for like lulbins, like I said, the net commands are useful for them finding admins, the domain admins, the enterprise admins, the schema admins, whatever they want to find. And NLTest helps them find like the domains that are in the network, the trusted domains and stuff like that to give them information. And whowill's really handy because that'll tell them. I think I forgot what whowill does, but it's also another one that you don't see used legitimately by admins much. So it's a good signal to noise ratio for that one. And I would say it's common, and it's common for like malware like Qbot, which is now gone, but IcedID and ursnif and all those malwares, they use a lot of these commands too as their initial bot recon to get information about the network. So they're pretty handy to look for as well for that reason. One of the first tools that they had listed in their forum dump was Subdrill, which is like a really useful tool for red teamers. It gives them basically information about a domain, subdomains, and give you like information about like, oh, there's an RDP host here to remote in, or a jump box or something maybe that's hosted on the internet. So this is all going to be public OSINT, so it's not something you can really detect on because it's going to be just what's out there publicly, but it's probably a good idea for you to run it because you can see what's public on your network and that's facing out to the world. Cobalt Strike, which is probably a surprise to nobody, is a pretty infamous pen testing framework. A lot of stuff I went through on this was like Cobalt Strike related. So there was like how to set up a Cobalt Strike server. Here's like here's the script to like run to basically get it running, sub in your domain here and stuff like that. Their command lines, a lot of them were how to use the Cobalt Strike beacon to escalate privileges and stuff like that. So it's not a surprise. So again, with Cobalt Strike, they have a section to set up it to make it more stealthy. So they point to C2 concealer from 40 north to basically help conceal the C2, I guess. From seeing Cobalt Strike a few times, there's always a few things that will be the same as the default. So like as an example, Cobalt Strike by default injects into run DLL32 to execute code. So if you see that executing and making network connections out of the network, that's probably Cobalt Strike. They randomize some stuff, but like a lot of default stuff can be found if you just kind of Google some different ways to profile Cobalt Strike, or if you just Google a domain sometimes, there's researchers out there that find Cobalt Strike servers and post them on Twitter or on VirusTotal and stuff like that. So I always, when I'm doing any kind of OSINT, sometimes I copy paste a domain into Google and see what comes up, because sometimes you'll hit pay dirt on some malware and stuff like that. Again, with Cobalt Strike, there's some interesting examples here. On Twitter, there's Cobalt Strike bot, which tells you like the spawn to values, which, like I said, run DLL32 is the most common one, but DLL host and all that stuff is also pretty common. And those are good things to look for. If you see another thing that's kind of distinct, you'll notice in the top one there is they use the command line sysnative, which is like, it's like not a real path in Windows, it's like I think like a virtual path for binaries. So it's a good one to look for in a command line, because it's not as normal as just System32 or syswow, the 64-bit one. And then we have a Cobalt Strike blog at Red Canary as well. Yeah, some pretty good stuff. And then, yeah, looking for like JAW3 hashes and JARM and all that stuff is really good. So like I said, there's a lot of information out there on how to look for default Cobalt Strike. And a lot of times, if you look for every single kind of default thing about Cobalt Strike, you'll probably, even if they change one thing, there's still going to be like 10 other things that they probably missed along the way to make it not default. Another thing they use, obviously, is Tor. They use it kind of in the reverse as most people think about Tor, because usually when you're using Tor, you're using it to go out to mask your traffic going out to the world. They're kind of using it as a proxy coming in for SSH and RDP to come into a network. And so, like, here's an example: is Google updates.exe is not Google Updates. That's the Tor binary, and you can tell it's Tor because it's using command line options that are consistent with Tor rather than whatever Google updates.exe is, which I don't think is a real binary anyways, but like isn't consistent with any Google stuff anyways. But like the NT service, that makes it a Windows service, and then the TORC is like the I think that's like the list of Tor servers and jump nodes for it to use. So they provide that in the command line because maybe they want to use a specific set, or it's just that the ones they have pre-canned or whatever. So some like detection logic for Tor, you can look for if you see files being written related to the state, lock, and the cached microdesk, whatever that thing is, those are files that are related to Tor, and they'll exist as soon as you run Tor. Those files are written to disk, so they're good indicators that this is a Tor binary, especially that cached whatever thing. So, like I showed before, not necessarily in the user folder, but that's a pretty common place for those to be written. And then that TACF option is for your config file. And like a lot of this stuff, I was just found out by going to the website for Tor and just kind of looking at the command lines that are on the Tor documentation, and be like, okay, what's useful to an attacker here? Or what things do they have to use to run Tor? So as you can see here, this one's in appblocker.exe. Again, they're going to try to blend in with your environment as best they can, and blend in with any environment by just putting something in System32 and making it look like a system thing that sounds important or whatever that you don't want to delete or whatever. So, and then another tool they use is ngrok. Ngrok is basically a tool to reverse out a connection. A lot of admins will use it to host a web server on the internet. If they're trying to like test something, they might just set up a web server and then point ngrok at it so that they can redirect their traffic from outside the internet without having to do a lot of like DNS hosting work and stuff like that. And then they have like a script that basically sets up a backdoor for them using ngrok named sysmon, and they also use like the not sucking service manager to create that service to keep it running constantly after reboots. And then it installs SSH. Yeah, so again, SSH is also pretty common to Windows, but like if you're seeing it installed on machines, it might be a low quality alert to something to keep an eye on or something to look for if you're already suspecting something's going on a machine. And then it creates a rule to allow SSH. Yeah, and then so ngrok is a pretty easy tool to set up. I played around with it a while back to like learn how to use ngrok. And you just kind of go to the website and you're just like, here, it just kind of gives you the step-by-step on how to set it up as well. So it's a pretty easy way to set up a reverse tunnel. And yeah, you can basically open up any port you want with ngrok. You could, and like they're going to use RDP for it. So if you see 3389, that's your RDP port. So if you see that in your command line for ngrok, that's probably not good. I mean, at work we play a game called Admin or Adversary. Sometimes you can't tell if it's just a really drunk admin or a bad guy, because admins do weird things on networks. So, but probably not good. It's probably something to at least look into if you're not already aware of it. And then with ngrok, it has to make a connection to ngrok.io or ngrok.com. So, and a lot of and if it's a tunnel, it's going to have TCP or tunnel in the domain name. So, as opposed to if somebody's hosting a custom app on ngrok, I think it has a different domain, a subdomain, as opposed to the tunnel. So that's another kind of signal from the noise. If you just look for ngrok, that's probably good. But if you need to narrow that down, you can look for those options, not command lines, those subdomains. Yeah, here's like kind of how easy this is like literally once you go to ngrok and set up an account, it tells you unzip it, which feels unnecessary, but whatever. You give it your token, and then you can just run it. You can run it however you want. So, yeah, I think with ngrok, it always writes the token, some config files to the user's folder, whoever runs it. So that's another kind of, I can't remember what the file name is for that token file, but like all these things, it's like it's good to like kind of run through the setup of a random tool like this just to kind of get familiar with it. And once you are familiar with it, you might notice things that are useful like this. Yeah, so with ngrok, here's their kind of, from there on the left and the right is some screenshots from this is my Google Docs version of their forum with some formatting and stuff like that thrown in. They tell you to register it, and then they have a script basically to set up their ngrok proxy and rename it to sysmon and some other stuff like that. And then the config and all that stuff. That's all sometimes that's in the config file. Sometimes they provide it in the command line. Depends on how they're feeling that day or if they're how evasive they're trying to be. And yeah, as you can see here, again, it's sysmon.exe, but I don't know if you guys have used sysmon before, but I don't think the options for it have all these command line options. So like knowing how to use sysmon kind of tells you, okay, this is not sysmon, this is something else. So that's another way I like to look for things that jump out. I don't think sysmon even uses YAML files. I think it uses some other format. Or anyways, those are kind of giveaways for you. Once you learn a tool like ngrok or sysmon or whatever, you start to know normal or bad or whatever like that. So some remote access tools they like to use. The most common I've seen is AnyDesk. It's Rat Trap from Transformers. I don't know if anybody remember that, but so you can look for it's a good idea in general to just standardize. Okay, what remote access tools do we use here at my company, at my network? Because a lot of people use TeamViewer, but also a lot of attackers use TeamViewer. So it's good to get familiar with who uses TeamViewer, what boxes use TeamViewer normally, maybe. And then it's also good to also profile all the other remote access tools. This one's become a lot more important lately with Scattered Spider because they really like to use a lot of these. So just kind of get familiar with it. Like you can look at your network traffic. For a lot of these, we'll give it away. If it's AnyDesk, you'll have connection at anydesk.com. Some remote access tools will have specific domains they reach out to tell you it's a remote access tool. Some don't have they'll just reach out to their C2 domain. But usually there's some kind of giveaway from the network and a host-wise, endpoint-wise to tell you it's a remote access tool. And yeah, also look at the folders that it's normally running from for you. From personal experience with net support, if it's running anywhere outside of program files, that's probably bad. It's a lot of the malware droppers like Sockghoulish and some of those fake updaters like to load net support, and it'll connect out to its C2 through like a config file. So you'll actually see the bad domain in the traffic. Other ones like AnyDesk and Atera, I don't think they have a network domain, a C2 domain that you can see in the traffic. So each of them is different, so it's good to learn how to use them. Again, it's a good idea to just kind of like play with AnyDesk, maybe on your work network, as long as the rest of your security team is aware that you're using it. It's good to play with these tools because they're safe to use for you to use. Really the only difference between a remote access Trojan and a remote access tool is like who's on the other end of the keyboard most of the time. So as long as you're controlling it, it's totally fine to interact with that because you're the one controlling that computer. So Sharp Chrome is another tool. It's kind of a tool to basically dump out passwords from the Chrome stores. So basically, they'll just run Sharp Chrome on a box either through a binary compiled into Sharp Chrome for Sharp Chrome, or they'll just use a PowerShell module to dump out those passwords. I think what I noticed a lot with this was they want to collect as many, they want to get to domain admin as quickly as possible because they want to get to that domain controller to work from there most of the time. So a lot of their focus to me seemed to be either collecting passwords for weird consoles and stuff like that, or just having those domain admin credentials quickly. So, another one they'll use is called invoke SMB autobrute, which is kind of basically a tool to brute force credentials through SMB, so that, I mean, you could just like, here we go. Okay, so it's another PowerShell thing. So with SMB autobrute, I'll come back to the others. They rely on it heavily basically because they can brute force credentials on SM for users and admins and stuff like that, so they can brute force those passwords. So, and then another tool they use is from PowerView is invoke ShareFinder. I haven't seen this one used again in many pen tests, but it's helpful for them to find all the file shares because eventually they're going to encrypt all those, so they need to know where they're all at. And in general, PowerView kind of just helps an attacker with domain recon and some enumeration on the network and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff in their documentation that was for invoke Kerberos. Again, that'll give them a token to basically log on to other endpoints from Empire. And then NetSPI, they had some stuff about powering up SQL. Again, it's a tool for attacking SQL servers, which is probably handy if you're one to. A lot of times, a company's really important stuff is on an SQL server, so that's pretty handy to have access to that data. In the source, this is one of the examples from the copied out forum that I had. This is for an SMB autobrute, and basically they just have like collect a password list. In this example, they had a domain even in it called Shook Construction. So rest in peace to them, or I guess I don't know. It's probably they've long since recovered. But so basically, they'll import the PowerShell module. They'll make a user list from their domain admins list. So they'll run like net domain admins and get a list of users, and then they'll basically have like a password list of really common passwords, like obviously like keyboard blocks, password 1, that kind of stuff. They'll also use like spring. What year is it? 2023. They'll use right now. They'll probably use fall. They'll have like fall 2023. They'll just make a password list from like the season, year kind of thing, which is a very bad idea to do. And then they'll also add in like the passwords they found, air quotes, from Sharp Chrome and some other tools that they could dump from, because with Sharp Chrome, they're probably counting on an admin reusing that password on their other aspects. So they'll probably have a nice little password list of of things to try to brute force. And with SMB auto brute, they can even set like the domain lockout is 3 attempts, so try each admin's password 2 times, so you're not going to lock them out or whatever, or whatever the lockout threshold is. Yeah, and then they have an example here. They're like, even like, here's the output of it, and yeah, here we got an admin from Cisco DIR service as an administrator. Yeah, and yeah, this is like I said, this is directly pulled from them. They recommend using password in the season and year. So yeah, again, and then they throw on some exclamation points and stuff like that. And I think a lot of the times they're basically going to try to dump out hashes so they can pull them into hashcat offline. So if they're probably going to try to dump hashes to use hashcat. Yeah, and then another one they'll use a lot is Rubius and curve roasting. So like, this will help you. This helps them with dumping out hashes from the network. Yeah, so they'll dump out hashes and they'll exfil those out to crack later with hashcat again. Yeah, we had a good blog post on curve roasting, I think. So, yeah, and yeah, it's from GhostPack Rubius. Again, a lot of these tools are all online to use, so I always highly recommend like going out there and playing with some of these red team tools, because again, they're safe because they're for a pen tester to use. So it's good to learn how they work and stuff like that. And here's kind of their guide on how to use Rubius. They have some like command line options. As long as it's an admin, try it. Output it as hash for hashcat and dump those to hashes.txt. That was another interesting detection thing I noticed with this, was a lot of the times they're going to dump the results of their output directly to the root program data. So if you notice text files being written to that folder, that's not a normal place to write stuff. I actually made the detection rule for this recently, and if you just have CMD outputting text files to that folder, the only thing that really does it is Dell for some reason. But like, you'll notice a lot of times, like, you'll have like a detection rule, and you're like, this is never going to have any false positive whatsoever, but you're going to have one weird vendor that does something weird like this. But other than those Dell binaries, it was like dead quiet, and it's caught a couple things here and there already. But yeah, and then they kind of have a guide on how to use Rubius, how to roast credentials and get all that stuff out of a domain. Yeah. Yeah, and then they kind of have some like options that are useful for brute forcing stuff there. And then AD-Find, again, this is probably a tool that like, it's an admin tool, and I do see some places that use this tool normally, but AD-Find in general, you should probably alert on it, because it's I see it used by Conti uses it. Who was the other one? I think Play Ransomware is another ransomware group that uses this. But like, ransomware groups will use it a lot because it's already has everything you need to recon a network. You can dump out users, computers, domain trusts, and all kinds of stuff out of it. So it's easy, and out of their example, they have a batch file there. That batch file, I believe, is pulled from the DFIR report, and they mentioned that adf.bat file a couple times in their documentation. So it's a pretty good tool to look for. Let's see anything else. Yeah, again, I think in some of these, no, in this one they're not sending it to program data, but again they're dumping everything to a text file. So I guess if you see AD-Find sending stuff to a text file, that's also pretty weird. Not abnormal, because I think admins will do that, but like, again, it's kind of signal to noise depending on your network. So yeah, and then here's their example of how to use AD-Find. They have like a whole guide on how to like use the output of AD-Find to recon stuff. So they'll basically, like they did in the previous slide, they'll dump out all the AD users to a text file, or all the computers to a text file, and then off network they'll tell you to like, they'll tell the operator to like look through these for the admin. Look for keywords like administrator and stuff like that. Um, and yeah, so they said turn to their home analyst and look at it. So like, just they'll be like, open it up in Notepad and like look for administrator or I think in this case they found, I think the username was something in here. Anyways, um, yeah, they'll say like usually you'll find a couple and then you can target those guys, those administrators, for your privilege escalation purposes. Um, yeah, and then seatbelt. Seatbelt is a tool to basically give you privilege escalation opportunities on a host. It's again, if you notice here, again, you got the text file going to program data. Um, but basically, if you run it, it gives you a whole bunch of information about the host you're on, and it'll tell you like this binary is vulnerable to service or path coding or whatever it is. Like so, like if they could drop a binary in the root of the drive that says program, so if something is not quoted for program files, they can execute program.exe or something like that. Um, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I should be okay. I usually go too fast on this anyways. Another tool, again, this was one I wasn't familiar with until I started going through this, was this net GPP password, or I think I'd seen it. But basically it looks for plain text passwords stored in group policy settings. Uh, if you're not familiar, in the group policy, there's like some text files that sometimes administrators just store the password in a command line for that service or something to run. Um, so they'll I think in the they used a standalone binary that's compiled from a PowerShell script, but it's also a PowerShell module, so they could probably do both of those things. Um, so both work for them. Yeah, there's the PowerShell module. Yeah. And then SharpView. Like I said, it's a port. It's a C# port of PowerView, which is it's a standalone tool to let them get recon of the network. Yeah, and it's also like I said, it's a pretty useful tool to look to recon a network, get privilege escalation opportunities and stuff like that. Okay, and then zero login. They said it was like their own binary that they made or whatever, but it's basically, it was a tool. This is like the only CVE I think I noticed in all this documentation it's basically a binary that lets them execute code on a domain controller, which, doesn't sound great. Yeah, so it gives them, code execution. It's pretty simple, straightforward, but here's this is from CrowdStrike. This is kind of like a flow of how this like command, how this tool works. Is it basically, and it gives them exploits, and I think it can do more than just code execution. I think you can dump stuff off a domain controller and read files and things that you shouldn't be able to do normally. Yeah, and then here's on their documentation. Here's kind of how their command line to use it. Like it's the executable and the domain controller in the command line, and then there's like options and switches and stuff like that. The tech sees the command they want to run, or if they want to just do some other stuff against it, there's the options they have in their own tool, which, again, I think they said it's of our own design. I don't know how much what that means exactly, if it actually they did that or not, but some sneaky registry things that I noticed in there. There wasn't much as far as registry, but a couple of things that I learned when I was going through this was they mentioned this in a script they had. I think I might have it in the next slide. They target this special accounts user list and add a user to it. So this actually makes it to where at the login screen, if you add a new user, usually at the bottom left on Windows, you have like users you can log in as. When you add a user to this list, that's gone. So that's a nice little sneaky way to be sneaky. And then another thing they'll do in that registry path, they'll change the RDP port to something else like 2222 or whatever they want to change it to basically make it to where you can't see your RDP traffic on the network because a lot of network appliances look for that port or whatever. Yeah, and then here's the example of how they use that. They install AnyDesk. They set a password. That's a thing with AnyDesk is I think when you install it, you have to set a password. So they do that in the command line. They create a user. They add that user to an administrator, and as an administrator, probably as one of the exploited user accounts they had, so they have remote access, and they hide that account from being visible. And then on the one below is them changing the RDP port here to 1350, and then restarting terminal services, which is your RDP service or whatever. Yep, and then there's some privilege escalation stuff. Like I said, it's kind of simpler than you'd expect. They'll find, like, this is kind of their path to it is like they'll find the users with 80 finds. They'll use Sharp View to find a workstation that they could target with the recon tools it's got. They'll remote into that workstation and use pass the hash with Cobalt Strike, and then a lot of times they'll just say, like, look through the browser credential stores, password managers, text files on the desktop. Yeah. So here's kind of their example on the forum page I had here. So they're like, this is like pulled straight from it, and this is the user account they're targeting was gpedit. So they look for interesting directories. They look for like LastPass or KeePass or some of the credential vaults in the Chrome, the location where the Chrome credentials are stored, which is like the login data folder there. And they say they'll target the roaming folder, which is, again, in Windows, the roaming folder is kind of where you store a lot of system settings on a computer and stuff like that. So it's a lot of passwords and credentials are stored there for Chrome and Firefox and that kind of stuff. And they're just like, sometimes an admin just has access or .xls on the desktop or passwords.xls, which is sad. It makes me very, very sad. But like, I think I encountered that at my first job. I was like, I would remote on other people's computers. You just see like passwords.txt, and you're like, please don't do this. Yeah, so much better. Yeah, so like, another thing they'll do is they'll target the Exchange, your OST file. So in Outlook, your OST file is kind of what stores all your email. So if you could dump that out, you could look through for passwords that are sent from help desk and stuff like that. And then they'll also recommend restarting Outlook because this is going to be a file, most people have Outlook open most of the time. So if you try to just copy that OST file out, it's going to be locked. So they have to restart Outlook for them to basically copy that file out to unlock it. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the last things they'll do. One of the primary goals they're going to do is they're going to dump out the domain controller's ntds.dit file, which is like your domain controller's usernames and passwords. So that's kind of bad if you get that. And a lot of times what they'll do is in their documentation, they'll enable shadow copies. They'll find that shadow copy and then copy out the dit file from that so that they don't have to run ntdsutil, which is a pretty big red flag these days, and it's using VSS admin. It's a lot sneakier of a way to do it. And then they'll zip that ntds dit file up and then exfil it out. Yeah, so this happens with domains. A local domain, you have to, if you see this happen, you have to reset your domain controller's Kerberos ticket twice. And if you're actually on a cloud, an Azure cloud network, I think you do it 3 times even. So just something to keep in mind if you see that happen. And then here's their guide on how to do it. They list the shadows from the domain controller with WMIC. That's another good one. Is if you see people interacting with volume shadow copies using WMIC, that's a pretty big red flag, and is a pretty good detection moment there. Yeah, they'll target the domain controller and use that. Basically, they'll dump out all that dit file using VSS admin. So another tool they use. This is something it's not really easy to detect, but they're already remoted on using Cobalt Strike. So they'll mount that computer to browse through it using FileZilla from their side. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you see FileZilla on your network, it's a pretty normal admin tool, but it might be good to keep an eye on it because it is a good, easy way to get files out of a network too. And I haven't seen it used in a while, but they were using rclone. Basically, rclone is like rsync, but it's It's an admin tool to basically back up files, and they use it to basically exfil a lot of files out of the network. And we actually had a pretty good blog on it from May the 4th, so because it was our Clone Wars. This is one actually after I made this presentation, I made a tool they made a tool basically to decrypt Veeam passwords. So they have a set of commands basically that dumps out the hash from a Veeam server from SQL. So they have like a whole one of the main thing you'll want to look for with this one is this SQL command at the bottom that's highlighted, and looking for password and the backup credential stuff. This is not a normal command to see be running. I think I put it in. I created this detector, and immediately it caught like a couple instances where they were dumping this out. And here's an example where they're running it. This is from an actual host. They basically, again, they dumped the Veeam hash out to a text file using this tool. Once they had done that, they ran an executable they compiled on the same host called veeam1.cs, and it's basically, I don't know if I have a screenshot of the actual, but it's a really simple like C# file that just basically takes the results of that previous command and creates that hash for the Veeam server to remote in for their for context, Veeam is a tool for VMware to back up its hosts. So again, you can see why a bad guy would target that, because that's where a lot of your valuable hosts are on the network. Yeah, and that's an example of the only binary I could find on VirusTotal of it, because they're compiling it on the host they're going to run it on. So it's probably going to be unique hash every single time. So looking for this hash is not a useful thing, but maybe looking for veeam1.exe is a pretty big red flag. Another thing they'll do is they have a big batch file script to stop all the services on a host, because they're probably about to start encrypting things at that point. So they need everything, like that Outlook file, they need everything, all the files that might be valuable to people unlocked and ready to be encrypted. So now what? This is a slide I actually added after this. I'd done this presentation like a year ago. But now with Conti gone, there's a lot of groups out there now. They're to be aware of, like Akira, Lockbit, Alfie, and all them. They're pretty much the same thing. They basically use the same playbook with some variations. I think Akira uses a Cloudflare tool instead of Ngrok. That's pretty much the same tool. But so they'll do a lot of the same things, just in different ways. And then Scatter Spider is kind of a newer one. With Scatter Spider, they're more targeting the identity provider to escalate their privileges, and then they're just using a whole bunch of remote access tools, like 100 times more remote access tools than any other one. So, I guess as like a summary, to me, like it's really useful to like read the manual on tools, because you're going to learn a lot about how a tool works to learn what you're going to expect when there's bad going on. Conti's disbanded, but like all these tools and tactics are out there still. Kind of learn your network is a really important thing. A lot of times if you start at a SOC, the security alerts you get when you first start, everything's going to look bad because you don't know what's good or bad. So kind of, if you're working alert for the first time or whatever, just kind of like start with this is probably good, I need to prove it's bad mentality, rather than the opposite most of the time, because I think that's a lot of mistakes some analysts make when they're working alerts, is like until you learn your network, I would stay skeptical about your alerts. And then 0 days, the only, like I showed you here, I think the only 0 day that was mentioned, wasn't even a 0 day. I think that was a vulnerability from 2017, and this was dumped in 2021. So like that was a 4-year-old vulnerability in their documentation. So like probably patch things is probably a good idea, especially vulnerabilities that are easy to exploit, like that one that already have like custom tools and stuff. So just kind of be aware of those, and you don't have to patch things the day of vulnerability 0 day drops. You don't need to freak out most of the time, I would say, because it usually takes attackers like a couple months before they start weaponizing things. So. Yep, that's it. Yeah, I would say, yeah. So like, is there like a lot of they try to cover themselves up, right? Is kind of what you're saying. Like, are they how sneaky are they trying to be? I'd say a lot of them, their goal is to be fast. So they're not trying to. Most of them aren't trying to be subtle in that way. I'd say like they're gonna. So I think some of the DFIR report ones I've seen, they've gotten the ransomware in like 4 hours. So like their goal is to get domain admin as fast as possible most of the time. So I'd say they're not going to be. Most of them aren't going to be that subtle. Most of the ransomware operators aren't subtle. I think the polar opposite of that is like an APT because their goal is to get data out without being seen. So I'd say no, they're not subtle most of the time. It's just making good alerts and stuff like that will go a long way for finding these things.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you'll see FileZilla used to exfiltrate files. Do you ever see WinCP or like Total Commander?
Yeah, actually, I think there was. I didn't. I wasn't. I mean, like, we had an incident for a customer where they were using. I think the attacker immediately installed WinSCP themselves and were starting to exfil files out.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a good one. They didn't mention it in theirs, but yeah, that's definitely a good one to look for. I think another one that a lot of ransomware groups use that I didn't see in this actually was Impacket. I think
Okay.
is it Bian Lan or something like that uses Impacket. So Impacket's another big one to use. I think the Alfie encryptor has it built into it, so it can like pivot through networks without any effort.
Okay.
So yeah, yeah.
Sorry to step out, but you talked about linking rules to work detection. What linking rules is what?
So at our job we have like YAML files that basically say like process name is 80 find.exe or something like that, and it has like these command line options, or it has like a network connection to this domain. If for a really good resource is Sigma. Um, Sigma rules are kind of like open source detection rules. So like I could just look for, they kind of have a vendor agnostic way of like looking for detection rules. Like this one's a 7-zip zipping up dump files. So like that's a good place to start if you need detection rules for a network. And then you can they have a tool to basically convert it to your SIM through Sigma. So Sigma's a pretty good tool for that if you're looking for good detection rules.
I have another question for you.
Yeah.
Can it make it confusing trying to identify a threat group when they're all kind of using the same backbone
Yeah,
techniques?
for sure. I think I'd say most of the time for a blue teamer, it shouldn't matter identifying it. I think some people get hung up on trying to figure out who's in your network. Most of the time, people defending a network, you just need to know they're in your network and you need to get them out and how they got in.
Right.
People, if you do need to identify them, if you're working on that kind of thing, Googling like command lines and like some of the tools they're using will often point you to blogs about things. I think I was like Googling like somebody's running a DLL out of the music folder on a host, and I Googled that and like it pointed me right to a Play ransomware blog or Cactus or something like that. There's like a lot of times just Google like a lot of OSINT and cyber threat intel is just Googling really aggressively for things. So a lot of times, if you need to identify stuff, just Google a lot of things, and you'll find something sometimes.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay. Any other questions for our speaker?
I'm at exactly 9. So.
All right, let's give it another round of applause, guys.
Hand this to you, I think.